Hello, and welcome to the Inside Social Work podcast, where we take a peek behind the scenes into different fields of social work, engage and inspire practitioners, translate research into practice, and encourage lifelong learning. I'm your host, Marie Vakakis. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's podcast episode. Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. This week's episode is a little different to some of the others, and I'm really excited about it. For a little while I've been looking for someone to talk about a lived experience and to share their story about being a social worker and also having experience as a service user. So with this episode, I chat with Matthew Jackman, and Matthew shares with listeners some of his experience being a service user, how he's advocating for change, being a peer worker, and a whole range of really interesting things that he's doing. And in particular, one of my favorites is a subject that he's teaching, which is called Mad Studies. And you'll get to hear all about what this thing called Mad Studies is. And here's some of Matthew's experience and advice and some of the things he suggests to those who are maybe considering talking about and sharing their personal story and using it as a superpower. He's a really big advocate for rethinking how we do social work and for challenging us to think about our own experiences, our own position in society, and who we're really there to serve, and how we can do that a little bit more inclusively, how we can do it a little bit differently, and how we can use social work to promote change and the difficulties in advocating for change when we're often employed by some of those systems that are also oppressive and have contributed to some of these injustices. It's a really great interview, and I hope you enjoy listening to what Matthew has to say. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 34 of the Inside Social Work podcast. Today I'm interviewing Matthew Jackson. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your bio is probably too long for me to pick out the best bits and introduce you. Do you want to share with the audience a little bit about who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. I guess firstly, most importantly, I'm a person with living experience of what psychiatry defines as bipolar and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm a person that's had living experience of in the out-of-home care, foster care system, and have lost my mum to suicide, and have been a young carer to my younger siblings who live with bipolar and schizophrenia, again, as defined by psychiatry. So I've had lots of sort of divergent and converging lived experiences that have sort of shaped the advocate that I am today in social work. And a lot of my social work in terms of my practice has been in clinical spaces, so in forensic mental health and in the federal government, of which I didn't last long. I really use a lot of my lived experiences now in global mental health work. So I'm the Global Lived Experience Ambassador for Generation Mental Health, and I represent our region, the Western Pacific region, on the Global Mental Health Peer Network. And I'm a global shaper with the World Economic Forum, and do some ad hoc consultancy and lived experience consultancy for the World Health Organization. So I'm trying to move more into the social action, social enterprise space with a focus on systemic advocacy, as I'm burnt out from clinical practice.
There's so many things that you're getting involved with, which is all of them could be an episode, I guess, on their own. How do you find your social work background, I guess, equips you for some of those things?
Yeah, well, I guess to me, I was always very attracted to social work because of my experiences of injustice. And I think many of us in social work are attracted to social work for that reason, because its focus is on rights and its focus is on looking at the intersections of oppression and the layers of disadvantage that impact someone's opportunity and access in life. So through my own experiences, I came to social work and experiences of social work. And I think through studying social work, I really had such a great breadth of understanding the person, the psychology or the intrapsychic, but the focus wasn't solely on that, which was really important for me. So the focus being more the sociological, political science and economics, more the structural and social factors. And I think that really helps scaffold a lot of the advocacy that's required to be undertaken at any level, but particularly in a global space where we have great structural determinants, around violence, trauma, poverty, colonisation, and we will never be able to redress those issues from an individual psychological framework. So the knowledge base of social work really helped me. I think the systems thinking and training in ecosystems work is really beneficial in terms of any systemic advocacy, particularly in global circles. And my brain works well in circles rather than a linear way. So that really helped. And of course, all the micro skills that come with building relationships, working in teams, and working in systems. So I'd say that the focus on those and with an intersection of looking at power and understanding how to use power for good really scaffolded my career.
You've got the job. that was yeah, I don't know what job, but that was fantastic. So you share a lot about yourself when you talk about the experience you've had growing up and all the networks you're in, but you often, even just now, didn't seem to talk about your qualifications. How do you find that? Is that intentional, or is that just something you think that's not who I am? Like, how do you kind of fit those two? Because a lot of people might introduce themselves as I'm a social worker and I've got this qualification, I've been working for this many years, and your way of describing it is a little bit different. And I imagine that's not accidental.
No, it's definitely not accidental. I think social work suffers from this, injustice in knowledge that we privilege. We call it epistemology or epistemic injustice, where we value certain knowledge over others, like biomedicine and law, and deprivilege others, like Indigenous and cultural understandings, lived experience, and of course, social work is maybe not as far down as lived experience, but with sociology, the focus is at the bottom of the privilege pool in terms of knowledge. So to me, I really read attention, it's an advocacy effort to read attention that I place value, expertise and privilege my lived experience and cultural and spiritual explanations of the world over any particular professional qualification. I believe in a real decentering of professionalisation, particularly in social work. My qualifications have just harnessed my lived experiences, but my lived experiences have made me the person I am today.
Great. Thank you for explaining that a little bit more. You teach something called MAD studies. What is that?
So I'm really, really excited about this because MAD studies is like the equivalent to queer and women's studies. So it really centers on a disability framework or disability studies framework that looks at challenging the dominant biomedical model in mental health. And obviously mental health impacts all different areas, not just mental health itself, as mental health is us, it's humanity and living. And so MAD studies is really an attempt, it's an interdisciplinary emerging discipline. It probably emerged, initially out of the civil rights movement of the 70s. And it's sort of gained the name MAD studies as a reclamation of madness, as people that have been deemed mad by psychiatry and by the diagnostic frameworks that are used to deem us mad. As a systemic advocacy attempt to reclaim, our own expertise. So a lot of the disciplines around consumer and lived experience interventions and research and theory, that's ground up and experiential. But a lot of it's actually around very hardcore critical social work, which is looking at the broader social and structural determinants that impact distress and reconceptualizing diagnosis as distress and locating most of our distress actually in unequal and unfair and unjust societies, such as racism, poverty, sexism, homophobia. And that's what actually fosters our diagnosis, not some sort of made up brain disorder. So it's basically an alternative to psychiatry discipline.
I think it makes me think, you were talking about the systems thinking, and as a trainee family therapist, I can see what you're saying when we're looking at families and couples and relationships that sometimes what we might label as depression is a very natural response to feeling disconnected or not having your attachment needs met, feeling like the person that is supposed to protect you isn't protecting you. Like,
Mm.
that's just the symptom. That's the bit on top of, the tip of the iceberg that we're seeing. But underneath that, there are a lot of other things that if we don't fix, it's probably not going to go away.
Absolutely. And I think it's just about delving a bit deeper into, people's presentation and what's actually going on beneath the surface, which is ironically not beneath the surface because it's located in the structural context. So it's about looking at gender and sexuality and roles and all sorts of things that are constructed by, often colonial, patriarchal, white Western ways of thinking and doing, which has kind of screwed us all over in many ways. I'm really excited that MAD Studies is both a discipline. It's called an in-discipline in that it's the idea of the disciplines to also promote activism on the outside. It's not just this academic, ivory tower. Is that most of it is actually, the idea of the ideas and the people in MAD Studies is to promote that community development and social action outside of the institution.
Mm. It's interesting that you say it's screwed us over in many ways, because that's a lot of the conversation that's come out of the uh, like not debate, but I guess conversation of Black Lives Matter, particularly in the US, where some of their healthcare systems or education systems were set up in a way to, oh, we don't want those people to have, to be lazy and to not have, to have these benefits, but then it actually impacted everybody.
Mm.
So these kind of judgments that were made about somebody getting a free ride or not allowing them to have access to something because they didn't deserve it essentially ruined those services for everybody. So
Mm.
there was some really interesting stuff coming out of that.
I think so, and again, Mad Studies really speaks very, fondly to the intersection between race and madness, and that a lot of madness is deemed as deviance by white people, often white upper class heterosexual men, which is the foundations of psychiatry as well. And we haven't really evolved away from those diagnostic models of understanding and supporting or treating, in the words of medicine. And that we still hold on to the that sort of relic of thinking from the 19th and 20th century, when really we need to be challenging and dismantling that sort of thought and really critiquing our own positionality of power. And I say that as a white man, cisgendered man. Sure, I'm queer. Sure, I've had a pretty shit upbringing, and I've had a lot of other disadvantaged intersections, but I have a role and responsibility and a privilege in utilizing, my whiteness and my maleness for good, and in sharing that. Leadership is about sharing power. So I think it's really good that we're having these conversations because we all have a responsibility to be accountable.
And I like what you were saying about constantly reflecting on your internal self and your position in society. The episode just before this one comes out, Joe and Alice they've started a social work newsletter, Social Work Talks Quarterly, and we were sort of discussing that the degree is just the starting point. That's almost the bare minimum you need to take a step into the field. And to do it well, and I'm an advocate for that, is you never stop learning. It's not just textbook learning, but it's looking at how am I positioned in this world? What assumptions am I making? What beliefs am I holding about everything?
Mm.
And I've used the example several times where, I was naive enough to give somebody a worksheet saying, I'll just complete this at home around the dinner table with your family.
Mm.
I don't know that they sit down around the dinner table with their family. Like, we're always having to reassess those assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And even in social work, social work is by nature is quite conservative as a discipline of knowledge and quite homogenous in terms of the people that work within the discipline. And I think it's changing, but we need to critically reflect on, I guess, some of the handmaiden to oppression that social work's involved in, whether with government or with medicine or with law. Often social workers are asked to be the handmaiden to oppression, and try and work within that system, even though we're being paid and funded by that system. So it's really important as a professional self, but a personal self, that we do reflect on that. And most of my best learning has come from being either a worker in the system or a service user in the system.
Mm. So moving, that's I guess a good segue into why you chose to share your story in your social work role. Like what a lot of people, were talking about just before we started recording, that we all have a lived experience in something. And
Mm,
even if we look at kind of the more conservative mental health stats, they'll say, there's a lifetime prevalence of mental illness of around 45%, if not higher. So the good chance is one of two of us will have had a lived experience. But
mm,
very few people use that as maybe not leverage, but as fuel for their career and are vocal about it.
mm.
What's made you decide that that's how you wanted to position yourself?
Well, I think I've lived a life in shame, and most people do with a living experience, and I think there's an othering as well of we don't know a lot about the etiology of distress, and depression looks very different to schizophrenia, and schizophrenia looks very different to a personality issue, and that looks very different to bipolar, and we talk about them all as if they're the same thing, and everyone can kind of now relate to anxiety and depression on a spectrum. And there's been a lot of great stigma busting and awareness campaigns around that. But what's happened is that it's othered more lower prevalence issues, issues that we don't really know, we don't really know very much about in terms of the neurobiological makeup. There's no real biomarkers in psychiatry for any diagnosis. And it just speaks volumes about how little we know. So for me, it's just about owning it and taking out the power of shame, and people are connected to change through story and emotion. So for me, using my story and using that emotional experience of humanity is actually a way to connect people to perspectives that maybe are quite radical, not radical to me, but radical to them in terms of new concepts. And moving away from a biomedical medical understanding of mental health is quite radical to a lot of people. So the way you do that is by connecting your own story and speaking articulately to how your story relates to more of a trauma, social, structural focus in mental health. So that's, to me, it's a strategic advocacy method as well, and I think, yeah, I think people also, it's also my way of addressing stigma in community. And I think particularly for professionals in the field, there's even more stigma, as if you can't, have had adversity or whatever, a diagnosis, and still work as a professional. I mean, it's just nonsense. So, it's sort of my attempt at my own intervention at redressing stigma as well.
Have you experienced any hesitations or, some challenges in making that decision to go kind of public with the lived experience that you've got?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's like any system, it needs to be safe, and not every system's safe to fully disclose. I mean, it's becoming harder for me because I am so public. But there will be, like any advocacy, you need to be strategic about, the messaging, the power in the room. You need to be considerate of all those things. I've lost 2 jobs because of my mental health. Some of the worst supervisors I've had have been social workers. Some of the most discriminatory have been social workers. So, I'm as much a critic of the profession as I am an advocate. And I think, social work is often molded by other areas. So it's really important that we stand firm and really walk the talk within our own profession. Because, yeah, I've had some very bad experiences within departments of social work that really haven't been very nourishing of my mental distress when I've been struggling.
That's sad, and it angers me because I would think, and I'm not in a position where I'm hiring lots and lots of people, because so it might not be a very valuable perspective, but I would much rather someone say, this is my story, this is what I need, these are my red flags, and then we work with that, rather than someone pretending all is good. And it's impossible. We all have something happening at some point in our lives, whether it's our own physical health, mental health, caring for someone. Someone might have a new baby, a relationship breakdown, an aging parent or grandparent. Like there's always going to be something.
Mm, mm,
And I
mm.
would think being more transparent and honest and saying, this is what my something is, this is what I need, and how can we work with it? will serve you well.
Yeah, I mean, that's all well and good until it impacts your performance. And we live in a capitalist world where our work is based on output. And if you're not performing at the level that you're expected to, no matter, and to be quite honest, very few people know about reasonable accommodations for people with, psychosocial disability. But yeah, very few people know how to handle it. And I think that's part of the issue is that, leaders don't really know how to support people in distress while still working, particularly in mental health and particularly in trauma environments if stuff's coming up. I mean, I lost my job in a federal government department recently, a few months back. I'd lost my partner due to quarantining back in Brisbane. I had stopped talking to my father. I'd gone to the office of the chief psychiatrist because my brother was on the verge of incarceration due to his psychosis. I had about 11 different stresses going on, and I was really struggling. And I was working with, veterans, experiencing trauma. And I was really struggling. And, I went on a new medication and that impacted my performance. And then a week later, I had a performance review and they said, look, they couched it in, we don't think you're a good fit for the team because, of course, you can't discriminate because of people's mental health. But that was just a great classic example of how, again, capitalist world, everyone's on contracts now. It's very rare you get a permanent full-time role, and you could be gone the same day. So, and in the same conversation, they said, we really loved how open you were with your mental health, but don't share that with your peers. So it's like there's conflicting messages, and saying we want you to be open, but we don't want you to share. So it's, that to me speaks volumes about, and that was in a predominantly social work based team. It speaks volumes about where we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that, not telling your peers, it makes me think, I mean, the advice I would give, I would give to anybody being in sort of the therapy space, counseling space. I mean, I think everybody could benefit from having their own kind of counselor or someone to talk to, just like you would go to the dentist. But I would think it's even more important if you've got a lived experience and you're working in a space. What are your thoughts on having somebody support you to share parts of your story with intention and purpose so that it all just doesn't flood out and you blur boundaries? So how would you, what are your thoughts on sharing what you need to share, but also taking a step back and recognizing not everybody has the same lived experience or the same stresses or the same coping strategies or lack thereof, and still having a bit of that professional lens while also using your story as a way to have a difficult conversation, perhaps?
For sure. Yeah, there's a lot in that because I'm a trained peer worker as well. And in the peer space, we're trained to use our lived experience, but that relationship actually be equal and that we're actually learning from the service users themselves. They're our peers. So there's kind of a real decentering altogether of professionalization and needing to be like this expert. So it depends on the role, I'd say, because I've worked in those sorts of roles as well, where I've just been a peer. Even though I still have all power because I'm paid. I'm there to learn from the service user, and we're both there to share stories and learn from one another, and kind of work our way through it. Um, but look, I would say absolutely, it's really important to have a really great external supervisor, someone that's not internal to the organisation, where you can share your grievances. And to be honest with you, most social work environments you work in or organisations will frustrate you, because they're shaped by a political environment that's about inequality and privileging the already privileged, and that's not what social work's about.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're going to be pretty PO'd for most of your career. So it's important to have external. It's important to have a mentor, and probably a mentor in the lived experience space. There's a lot of consumer supervisors out there, consumer academics now, particularly in Melbourne. So engage with those who are doing cutting edge global leading work as in the discipline of lived experience and how to use that experience safely. Or move into lived experience roles. There's a lot of social workers that work in consumer and carer roles, and they do that intentionally because they feel like they do better social work when they can speak to their own story and speak to other lived experience stories. More systemic, strategy.
In the peer workspace, there is, I know some organizations in Australia are trying to come up with some more consistent frameworks and training. But one thing I remember from doing a bit of work in that space was how you answer kind of curly questions from, if you're in a forum or if someone's like, oh, I'm taking this medication and you've had a bad experience with that. Framing things in a way that still, the underlying message was always one of hope,
Mm, mm.
and sort of, and this was what I took away from that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts is, you might say, yeah, I've also struggled to find the right fit. I've tried several different health professionals, but over time and with a bit of persistence, you eventually find what works for you. Instead of saying, yeah, you're right, that person's crap, that medication had awful side effects, I didn't like. You're still sharing your story, but you're eliciting a message of hope and acknowledging that there'll be different things that work for different people.
Absolutely, yeah, and you're right. Connection, hope, empowerment, partnership, they're all key principles of peer work, much like social work, but social work's still a little bit more removed from that, I have to say. Yeah, no, totally. I think it's about, honoring someone's experience, sharing where you're at, but you're also not there to give expertise either. Yeah, you're not there to sort of be like, oh, that medication was really crap, it didn't work for me. So it's not about that either. It's really about hearing someone out. Peer work in essence is really about like hardcore critical listening. It's about honoring experience. It's about validating. It's about acknowledging. I mean, how often, we all know, how often do we want to be told what to do by another person? We just want to be validated. We want someone to say, yeah, that really sucks. Someone's, coaching you on, your relationship advice or whatever. You don't want to hear their opinion. You just want to hear that what you're going through is, tough or whatever, So, yeah, I would completely agree with what you're saying.
So for new and emerging social workers, or those maybe considering jumping into the field, who might have concerns or might have been told because of their lived experience this is not a good job for them, what advice can you give them?
Firstly, that organisation is not the right organisation for you. And positionality and location is very important. So I would find safe spaces. I'd find safe organisations. There's plenty, that are lived experience driven or 50-50, in community mental health particularly. The more medical you go, the more clinical you go, the further removed from lived experience you are. So again, unless you don't share that in teams and you just share that in microcosm relationships, you share that in self-disclosure with family and consumers. So I think it's about finding safe organisations to work in. I think it's also about owning that story as well and finding its superpower, finding its power, which I've managed to do, but over a long period of time. And, I'm someone that's been in and out of hospital and have spent, over 6 months in and out of institutions and in rehab and, as a service user of the NDIS. So, I've almost lost my life. So it is also very serious. And yeah, it takes a long time to come to acceptance with your own story, and the antidote of shame is pride. And I think if we can find our roles in areas of pride, then we unlock our own personal potential as well as our professional potential.
So nowhere in anything you said was don't do it.
Oh no, do it, do it, do it. Highly
Great.
encourage you to do it. Yeah, I think there's actually a movement, like lived experience is starting to shape professionalization in mental health a little, and we're starting to draw on lots of different tools like intentional peer support, emotional CPR, the Hearing Voices group and network. These are all lived experience interventions that are actually starting to decenter professionalization in working relationships in mental health. In sharing more of your story, in being more of a peer, rather than having to be an expert, because we're not experts in other people's lives. We're there to facilitate story and hear and validate and work with and partner with. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this moving forward as medicine's dismantled and deconstructed in mental health.
It's interesting when you mentioned the Hearing Voices movement. I spent a bit of time pushing that in one of the services I worked for, and it's a shame that it took somebody who was a psychiatrist with a lived experience. Like the guy who started it was actually quite highly professionalized as well to actually get that to be taken seriously, that someone had to kind of with feet in both camps to be able to push that through.
And that's where the movement will come, is from people owning their own lived experiences in mental health. And to be quite honest, I don't know one professional that I've worked with in mental health that's not either a family carer or a consumer themselves in some regard, that's had experiences of mental health, who wakes up thinking, God, I'd really love a career in mental health one day. It's usually through our own personal experiences that we come to working in mental health. And yeah, I think the movement needs to come from within, again, which means dismantling professionalization and this like biomedical, like kind of a removal from like the human experience in mental health. We need to re-engage with the humanity in mental health, because the word clinical removes the human from the interaction. So we've got a long way to go. So that's exciting though for new graduates, because it means that they can be part of that movement and be an entrepreneur from within.
It's interesting you say that the word clinical, it removes it because there's a push to get that recognized through social work to have a bit more professional leverage. So trying to balance that space of to get recognized as a profession, competing or not competing, but often being not taken as seriously as some of the other professions, while then also trying to advocate for this decolonizing and rethinking of how we structure all our work.
Mm.
It's really difficult.
It's a complete contradiction, isn't it? Social work, and you're right, it is competition. But who's that serving? Who's social work serving if they're trying to clinicize the profession to compete with other professions which aren't already working for service users? That's just furthering the profession, not furthering the service users and family carers. So, this reformist attitude of social work becoming more clinical to try and compete as like second rate psychology, I'm not a big fan of it at all. I think social work can do great anti-oppressive work in clinical, or what we mean by more therapeutic roles. And I think there's a place for that. But I think the ASW hasn't focused at all on the structural determinants, the social determinants that actually impact on mental health. Their focus has been way too much on Medicare and competition. Um,
Which is a hard one, because being someone in that system, it's almost like if we can't get that recognition, then our voices aren't heard in those big spaces of being an accredited mental health social worker. I see the challenge in our skill set not being recognised with sort of health insurance companies, and really comprehensive reports being dismissed and someone preferring a GP letter. Like
mm,
if
mm.
we can't advocate for our clients, if people aren't taking our voices seriously, you'll hear on the news, they'll talk about so and so with this profession, and they really listen to that person's words. But if you say social worker, it's like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think social work, in a way, it's kind of good for social work, because it kind of means that we're doing our job as well, because we're not as valued, because we actually honour disciplines that aren't, bases of knowledge that aren't as valuable, which is good. That's what the discipline's about. So it's how do we honour, being oppressed ourselves, because we honour less powerful knowledge bases like indigenous, cultural, spiritual, lived experience understandings and sociology, but still fight within a system of the psych science, being psych nursing, psychology, psychiatry, and biomedicine and law. How do we still compete and fight with that empowered knowledge base, but still like do the work that we need to do? Social work's in this really unique position, as a profession, of sort of fighting against the very system it exists within, but also trying to, find its way in that and leverage what it can. And sometimes they're in complete contradiction of one another. So, in an ideal world, social workers would be dismantling all those systems altogether, all those institutions, and be working in more critical spaces. But within the current system, I guess it's about registration and more better recognition. I think social workers are notoriously not great at explaining what they do and what their point of difference is. And why social workers don't work at GP clinics, I don't know. So all those sorts of little things, where other professions have found their place, but social work hasn't in the institutional context. And I think that has something to do with advocating for justice and government not wanting social work to have a strong voice, because it does fight against the very, institutions of oppression, such as the government, that fund it.
Yeah, that could be a whole other episode.
No,
No, and I'm sure your students get to hear you talk about that and have some really rich discussions and critical thinking in your what was it, mad study subject. And you've mentioned bits and pieces of some of the key theories and frameworks you draw on, but are there any people who are looking to understand a bit more about a lived experience or some of the things you've mentioned that you recommend they read up on or check out?
Yeah, certainly. In terms of my reference before, I mean, Mad Studies, there's a great text called Mad Matters by Brenda Lefrancois. She's a social worker and a person who identifies as mad. And again, there's a number of us around the world that are kind of mad identifying that work within social work. So that's a really good text I recommend. But yeah, as I mentioned before, intentional peer support is a global leading peer work model around decentering professionalisation. So I'd highly encourage you. Again, the founder is a social worker, a mad person that went to study social work. Her partner's also a social worker. So we see these social work, kind of subversion within the lived experience space as well. Open dialogue is another great approach that I highly encourage students to look up. And that's looking at community systems work in supporting people in distress, and based out of Finland, and emotional CPR, as I mentioned. Just look up those websites. And there's a great text called Peer Work in Australia. And anything around critical mental health, I'd start revising critical mental health, because to me that's real, like, hardcore social work. And at a clinical level, that looks like anti-sanist practice, that looks like feminist therapy, that looks like narrative therapy. So it's about doing alternative, it's about alternative ways to working even in a clinical context. It's not just all about, bringing the house down at a systemic level.
Great. And I'll put some links to those and any other resources you want to send my way in the show notes. If there's one piece of advice you could share with the audience, either those who are graduates or maybe those who are listening who are in more senior positions, the choice is yours. What would that be, that piece of advice?
I think positionality is really important. I think, getting back to critical self-reflection and your place in society and exercising the power that you have is really important. So continually thinking about the layers of intersection that you bring to you, the person, and you, the professional, and thinking about how you can best use that to advantage in terms of doing work that's promoting rights and promoting justice. I think that's a key takeaway. I think the other key takeaway is just being yourself, being human. I think social work's power comes from us being really human and just being relatable. And the minute that we try to over professionalize and be more clinical, or try and be something that we're not, then we just kind of fall into the system of everyone else. So I think we can still continue leading by being ourselves. And the third thing is, I think social work actually needs to start positioning itself outside of its traditional roles in more community development, social action, social enterprise and impact spaces. Because we'll never be able to do great change if we're always just working within oppressive institutions. And we need to find positions of power outside of that to agitate those systems of and institutions of oppression, and that includes the government. So, they're my three takeaways, I think.
Great. And I've got a couple, or more than a couple of questions just about you as a person, if you are happy to just give quick answers.
Sure.
All right. What's the most recent book you've read?
I've been reading Feminist Therapy by Bonnie Burstow, because I'm just finishing off my Masters in Counselling and Psychotherapy, and I'm wanting to utilise more radical critical therapies in my practice rather than your traditional boring CBT.
So that's a bit of light bedtime reading for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I highly recommend it. She's an anti-psychiatrist by background, and she looks at how to use therapy and locate it to a structural context. So, looking at gender, looking at sexism, and of course that applies to everyone, not just people identifying as female, as, that are cisgendered.
Great. What's the last TV show you've binge watched?
Oh, that's a really good one. I love Ozark on Netflix. I don't know if you've seen Ozark.
It's very dark.
It is very dark. Maybe that's why I like it. I think social into really dark stuff, and I just find, the whole like drug smuggling and money laundering. I think maybe in another lifetime I would have been a money launderer or something. I don't know. But it's just a fascinating, I guess again a systems lens looking at kind of the darker side of the world.
What's one dish you cook well?
Does lean cuisine count?
Maybe you can order really good lean cuisine.
Uber Eats, lean cuisine. Look, my house is half Thai, and we cook a really mean pad Thai. So
we'll go with pad Thai.
when I say we, it's more like a psychiatrist and service user relationship. So I'd say he does 90% of the work, and or has the 90% of the power in that menu making process, and I have about 10%.
What's your favorite thing to do on a day off?
I love tennis, and I love drives. I love day trips. So sadly, with the pandemic, no day trips at the moment. But yeah, love getting outdoors.
What's your backup career, or what did you want to be when you were a kid?
I wanted to be a journalist and a paramedic, actually. But yeah, I think journalism, I think I could have seen myself in that. But I have to say, I do love a good karaoke session. So I could imagine being like Ariana Grande in another lifetime, to be honest. I love the stage.
So money laundering wasn't a childhood dream then?
No, not until I understood the concept and entered social work.
And the last question, is there a quote or mantra that resonates with you personally?
Well, that's a really good one. I read a lot of them. There is a really good one. I've forgotten exactly how it goes and by whom it is from. But it's just around. I mean, the disability justice mantra of nothing about us without us is something that I always hold to my advocacy work. And that obviously, centering the inclusion of lived experience and service users, whatever environment you're working in, is really important to me.
So nothing about us without us.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I'll put that on there.
Awesome.
But this has been such a lovely interview and really interesting to hear so many different thoughts and ideas. And I'm hoping some of the listeners will reflect on how they can, who they're serving, how they can do that a little bit better. And those who have a lived experience, not to be scared of jumping into social work and using that story as their superpower.
Yes, exactly. Story as superpower is so important, and finding pride in your work and pride in who you are is really important, because that's what changes the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for today's episode's resources, and don't forget to click subscribe and review us wherever it is you get your podcast.